Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Our first speaker in this session is Tara McPherson. She is a professor in the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. She is also chair of the Division of Cinema and Media Studies and director of the Sidney Harman Academy for Polymathic Study. She is the author of the very excellent Feminist in a Software Lab that was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. And she's also author of Reconstructing Dixie, published by Duke in 2003. She's also co-editor of 3 different collections published by Duke, California, and MIT. Finally, and just as importantly, she was, or is, Okay. Founding editor of the pioneering multimedia journal Vectors, and she is a lead PI of the online platform Scalar that was already mentioned a couple times this morning. So, Tara.
So again, I want to add my thanks to Maya and Thea and Laurie for all the herding they had to do to get us all here, and a shout out to all the people who have helped them make this event happen, because I know it takes a real army of people. So part of what I'll talk about today really comes from the book that I published last year that Laurie mentioned, but I'll kind of expand on some other activities a little bit as well. It's sometime in the 1990s. I wake to the realization that I've been dreaming in the most vivid color of my life, inhabiting deeply cinematic sequences full of interesting camera angles that shimmer with shadow and light. My dreams are highly edited, intricate sequences of shifting narrative and points of view. Clearly, my brain is processing in deeply visceral ways the lessons of film production that I am learning in a graduate seminar on feminist film, continuing to explore the visual language of cinema even as I sleep. Enrolled in an intense doctoral program focused on post-structuralism and feminism, I have dreamed theory as well. But this is different. These cinematic dreams are activating other senses. They are moving me through and around theory toward different but related ways of knowing. They will help inaugurate my commitment to practice, to making in the world, a making also grounded in my allegiance to feminist practice and feminist activism. They will come to guide how I will engage both media studies and the digital humanities, crossing the theory-practice divide. They help explain how I became a feminist in a software lab, one who doesn't code. Across the arts and humanities, theory and practice are often poorly integrated in our universities. Art practice is usually cleaved apart from art history. Few film and media scholars are also media makers. Digital design and programming get taught in different buildings, sometimes in different parts of campus. These divisions are reinforced by structures that make it hard to combine theory and practice, or science and humanities, in our curricula, evaluation and promotion structures, disciplinary methodologies, and privileged forms of scholarly outputs. Makers, lab technologists, less often hold tenured positions in professorships, and labs often serve to reinforce hierarchical divides. My employer, the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California, has long claimed to value the integration of theory and practice. Students across our school's 7 divisions, we have about 1,800 students, take courses in both making and in theory and history, but the programs are often poorly integrated. In an attempt to more seamlessly join critique and making within digital media studies, please come in. SCA launched the Institute for Multimedia Literacy in 1998, a research institute that eventually grew into a new division, Media Arts and Practice, that includes a practice-based PhD program in which students produce hybrid dissertations, undergraduate majors and minors, and more. In its original form, it was a lab of sorts, perhaps a studio, housed in a lovely space with lab-like classrooms slightly apart from main campus, where Liz visited us as a fellow. In its current form, it is more institutionalized, a theme I'll return to, although a few research labs are now part of its structure. As a program and as a space, it fosters aesthetic experimentation, deeply tied to critical theory, questions of representation, and social justice. So really quickly, I'll just show you a few grad student projects that are underway now to give you a flavor of what the students are up to. This is a bot that was built by PhD student Sarah Siston that goes out into Twitter and other formats and intervenes into conversations that are sexist in tone. So it's recognizing algorithmically certain keywords, and it tweets out statements, quotes from famous feminists over and over again, right? And it's a kind of care, a way to intervene in those spaces without being subjected to the kind of brutality of trolling that many women who intervene in those spaces experience. Catherine Griffith is also a MAP PhD, working on ways that we might think about the work of AI algorithms and understand their clustering techniques through visualizing their methodologies. Triton Mobley is interested in the racial contours encoded in the systems that we use in very unknowing ways day to day. This particular project is thinking about skin tone and blackness as it exists within digital art and media systems. Samantha Gorman works largely in AR and VR. She runs, as many of our MAP PhD students do, a very successful company called Tinder Claws that's released many prize-winning games. And Tindar is an AR game, not unlike Pokemon Go, that you take out into the world and interact with the environment, but you must feed it your emotions. So you get kind of used to uncannily scanning your face and thinking through the paradigms of emotion in different ways. The division has a commitment, obviously, to hands-on practice. There are also explicit commitments to theoretical inquiry, to activism and social justice, and to producing multimodal scholarly research. My own lab work began in the old IML, including support for the digital journal Vectors, now sort of twilighted, and later the authoring platform Scalar, which is very much alive. Such hybrid programs are still rare in the US, particularly at a department level, but their numbers are growing and they share space with very interesting European programs. And we also are seeing great growth, as today testifies, in makerspaces, labs, collaboratories, co-ops. Still, these programs often meet similar forms of resistance. Some such reactions might simply be characterized as an academic resistance to change, a traditionalism within the academy that tends to favor existing structures and approaches, and entreats emerging paradigms with suspicion, if not outright hostility. But another vector of opposition arises from those whose worries are more specific. That is, they worry that innovation labs and maker spaces hew too closely to the neoliberal techno-utopian logics of Silicon Valley. I'm very sympathetic to these arguments. In the US, it's not hard to see that there are lines of convergence between the rise of curricular programs like my own in digital technologies and the needs of corporate technology firms, many of whom sponsor the labs in the School of Cinematic Arts. Some of the technology programs are funded by corporate benefactors, other by the military, both at USC and elsewhere. And there is no doubt that such sponsorship torques scholarship and learning in very particular ways. And yet, such pressures seem to necessitate not a repudiation of the humanities' engagement with the digital, but rather a demand that humanities scholars increasingly operate in that very conjunction. If we're indeed concerned about the escalating corporatization of our campuses, we've just had to oust the president at my university. From online learning platforms to new regimes of management to casualized labor, that an engagement with technology and the digital seems a crucial, if not the only way, to engage these concerns. There are precedents in the recent history of the university that suggest how such conjunctions might take shape. My graduate education and early scholarly career centered on film and media studies, particularly on feminist film theory, maybe not the most likely trajectory toward a software lab. While my PhD program was in an English department, the opportunity to engage in media practice existed along the margins of our curriculum. One class in particular profoundly rejiggered how I would come to understand the relationship of making to theory, leading to the vivid dreams that open this talk. It was a team talk course by feminist theorist Patricia Mellencamp and video artist Cecilia Condit. Students in the seminar were encouraged to stretch outside of their comfort zones and work in mediums not familiar to them, be that print or video, and that's where I learned editing. The experience deeply reconfigured how I understood feminism and collaboration, and it gave me a hands-on engagement with making that continues to influence my research that engages both theory and practice. In the class, we were investigating how one might make media in ongoing dialogue with ideological critique. The course structure made it clear that the two were inextricably intertwined. The types of interactions like these are incredibly important for how we might conceive of the rich possibilities for a politically engaged, or we might say responsible, university-based lab. Feminist film studies emerged from an entanglement with what we now call critical making. If the terminology of the time was different, we could trace decades of feminist media makers blurring the lines between theory and practice. Their work powerfully illustrates how theory and making exist in rich feedback loops. They understood that technology systems mattered, and they needed to study them, but also to use them in new ways. It's hard to imagine Laura Mulvey, probably the most famous feminist film theorist, reaching the insights of her landmark essay on sexual difference and visual pleasure in film apart from her engagement with practices of production, her own record as a filmmaker. Many feminist film scholars in the 70s understood theory and practice to be constitutive of one another. Forged from a commitment to change in the world, these scholars and makers not only recognized that technology is never neutral, they also foregrounded the political in their endeavors. They investigated the ways in which communication technologies work in close concert with social systems and sustain social inequalities, not only at the level of representation, but also in their design, implementation, and structure. They also sought to intervene in media distribution, creating new networks for the circulation of media. And particularly in the UK, they sought to integrate making and critique through extensive pedagogical experiments, both in and beyond the university. This is the period of the Open University as well. These insights were often born of a deep exploration of the material forms of cinema, explorations that needed practice. Such work is vitally important terrain for digital studies today, leading us to ask how our machines encode culture in very particular and often damaging ways, while also perhaps signaling an enhanced role for artists and designers. These feminists likely would have called their efforts workshops, but lab may also fit. Still, feminist film and media studies today does not always exhibit strong ties to practice, as was evident at the formation of the field in the 70s. The conjuncture of theory and practice that was so crucial to the emerging field proved very hard to maintain as divisions increasingly embraced film and their curriculum, often severing theory from practice. I see this split as a loss to the field. Digital media studies or the digital humanities now offer the possibility of renewing the forms of dialectical inquiry so valued by feminist film scholars in the 70s and 80s. While there's no guarantee that emerging labs and programs will hold theory and practice in tension toward progressive ends, they can offer a space for such work to unfold. As the digital more and more infuses our everyday ways of being, writing, making, and thinking, we are also seeing a heightened call for a return to feminist modes of praxis. It is as if our daily digital immersions have reanimated a feminist longing for forms of practice that embrace yet also exceed theory. Such calls emerge from a wide variety of feminist scholars with diverse specialties, ranging from film and media studies to new materialisms to posthumanisms. For example, feminist philosopher Rosi Bordati wants to, quote, empower the pursuit of alternative schemes and calls for combining critique with creative praxis. Thinkers like Bordati, Jane Bennett, Adrienne Maree Brown, Anne Masalmo, many others, urge us to pursue practices that could make us dream differently. Such practices have the potential to call other futures into being and to move us from theory into praxis. Some of us gathered here participate in and have founded feminist labs, vibrant spaces intent on hybrid practices. I have learned a great deal from seeing how many of you navigate the spaces you inhabit, building vibrant places for reflection, action, and activism. I also want to shout out to some of my closer collaborators along the way, Anne Basalmo, Lisa Nakamura, Wendy Chun, and Alex Uhas. I have spent the last 15 years thinking through and experimenting with feminism and intersectional and deeply collaborative technological design. First with the journal Vectors here, and now with the software platform Scalar, and most recently through a recently launched lab, the Amundsen Lab. Vectors began over 15 years ago as a space for experimentation in screen languages, open access publishing, and collaborative design and authorship. The core production team was small for the first several years, Steve Anderson and I as editors, Eric Lawyer and Reagan Kelly as designers, and Craig Dietrich as technical lead. Based in a film school, we focused more on questions of the expressive capacities of media and interface than on large-scale digitization or text analysis. So little data, yes, but also aesthetic design. We aimed to publish work that couldn't exist in print, while also exploring new infrastructures for distribution. Our initial processes of production were quite different than typical journals. We developed a fellowship model in order to build a rich space for collaboration across difference, bringing together scholars, artists, technologists, editors. We collaborated largely in virtual space, physically touching down at the IML for face-to-face work and for summer institutes when necessary. We were interested in how multimodal expression might allow for different relationships of form to content, and wanted to explore the specificities of digital media for politically engaged scholarship. We asked how scholarship might more directly engage the emotions and multiple senses. We wondered how media might come together with the concerns of feminism, critical race studies, activism, environmental critique, and queer theory. We worked at the nexus of the arts and humanities. Consider the piece Public Secrets by Sharon Daniel, with design by Eric Lawyer. The piece opens with a voiceover narration by Daniel describing her regulated entry into a woman's prison, the largest in the world, near Chowchilla, California. The project includes many hours of audio footage, testimonies from imprisoned women that were collected by Daniel. The user can navigate the piece via a series of themes: inside, outside, bare life, human life, public secret, utopia, through individual women's stories, or in a more random fashion, or in some combination of all of these. The aesthetic design and structure of the project fundamentally reinforce its argument and goals, calling our attention to the shifting borders between inside and outside, incarceration and freedom, oppression and resistance, despair and hope. Through navigating the piece, the fine lines demarcating such binaries will shift, morph, reconfigure, grow fuzzy. unsettling any easy assumption about us and them in a carceral state. We experience the piece through eye, ear, touch, opening scholarship to multiple sensory registers. It is intersectional in both design and concept. The project also moved beyond the confines of the university, as it has been used by activist organizations and exhibited in museums and galleries worldwide. A project like Public Secrets begins to imagine new possibilities for the archive as it mutates into the database. It is a database with a point of view. It very much relies on the database to structure its content, but it also contextualizes the database, guiding the visitor's immersion in the piece, echoing the logic of the video game in order to unfold portions of the project at key moments in response to the path the user has taken. It encourages exploration more than mastery or completion. Other Vectors projects, they're all open access and available online, include this piece by Karen Kaplan, a feminist scholar who pursued the consequences and scope of military vision and has recently released a print monograph that repurposes the material and adds much more from this early project. A similar piece is Jennifer Terry's Killer Entertainments, which when YouTube was only just taking shape, repurposed from many video sites online at the outbreak of the Afghanistan war. Soldier-produced video that described their experiences. She collects, archives, and redacts those hundreds of videos to help us understand how the logic of video games has very much infused the terrain of warfare. Most of the links and these bright colors on these pieces are now dead because the places we archive, so the videos still exist, the links of origin have all disappeared, as many things on the web will do, including many Vectors pieces as time rolls forward. And Trevor Paglin did a piece with us. He's now a MacArthur Genius artist, but he was a grad student when he was our fellow. And we built an interface that allowed us to track the Janets, which were torture rendition planes that we didn't yet popularly know existed. But Trevor had a network of plane spotters who knew that these things were there. And for a year, we plugged into the FAA's database, which you could publicly access, and tracked the flight of those planes through space. We only kept it live for a year, and I'm happy to say nobody was arrested. Vectors projects reward slow reading, requiring attention and care from the reader. They ask us not only to stop and think, but to linger and feel. They are not so much interested in data mining a million photographs, producing an objective quantitative analysis, as they are invested in layering into the digital interpretive humanities techniques, such as close reading and textual annotation. But as much as I love the work we did with Vectors, there are many problems with it as well. The pieces poorly address the needs of disabled users, mostly built in Flash, some in processing. The projects were mostly one-offs that were labor-intensive, very labor-intensive, and demanding to create. Carefully integrating form and content for each piece required hundreds of hours of design, conversation, and programming time, even after special middleware tools designed by Craig Dietrich streamlined our production process. In an ideal world, I still believe that each scholarly project should find the design and structure that best suits its unique evidence, argument, and purpose. And that format will often be a print book. But that world would be hard to fund and perhaps even harder to sustain and preserve. In many ways, these Vectors projects were anticipating apps, for they incorporated multiple senses, even touch, into beautifully designed packages that served ear, eye, and hand before any of us had an iPhone. When we first launched Vectors, viewers were sometimes perplexed by the interfaces, although after several years of swiping across iPads, the interfaces seem decidedly less experimental now. Following our work on Vectors, we developed Scalar, a multimedia authoring platform that addressed many of the shortcomings of the Vectors work while also sacrificing some of my favorite parts. It's fairly scalable, hence the name. It's built with web standards and sustainability in mind. It interfaces with archives in rich and interesting ways. It features a customizable API for more adventurous users, our hack to allow more vectors-like pieces to emerge from Scalar's infrastructure. It's seen good uptake in university classrooms, libraries, museums. Several presses now use the platform, and it has tens of thousands of users. What it loses in quirky aesthetics, it makes up for in a certain robustness. We also foreground in the lab support in many Scalar projects we have nothing to do with. You sign up, you do whatever you want. But we do also still support projects, and most of those sustain our focus on issues of gender, race, and difference. These two slides just show you some of our collaborators at different moments. It was a very expansive group of people with hundreds and hundreds of hours of conversation before we even started to build software. And then these partners have kind of come and gone in various ways. This is a project that came out this year, many years in the making. It collects the materials from an activist organization called Third World Majority, which was in the late 90s, was one of the very first digital storytelling global youth initiatives. And the archive sat on someone's hard drives, and we culled with Kara Keeling and Thimosi Soundgarden the archive itself, which exists in the Scalar project, and then several scholars and activists wrote articles about the archive, pulling them in. So this is a book and an archive at the same time that preserves a moment in history. This is a project that's mostly an interactive choose-your-own-adventure game built in Scalar by Misha Cardenas, who at one point was a MAP grad student. This piece uses Scalar's API to tell a story about the tensions between incarceration and freedom across a very wide swath of history, focusing on the US, while also including pedagogical materials that could be used in after-school systems in many ways. UBC Press is developing Scalar extensions now through a grant we're collaborating on to support indigenous publishing. The Newberry Library uses Scalar for a very robust crowdsourcing project, so it's out there in many ways. I feel I can measure its success by the fact that I've now twice been asked if I'd ever heard of the platform Scalar by people at events. The software that underpins Scalar was born of the frustrations our scholars often experienced working with the traditional database tools we adapted for vectors. Vectors engaged intersectional, political, and feminist work at the level of content, but also integrated form and content so that the theoretical implications of the work were manifest in the aesthetic and information design. Scalar integrates this methodology at the level of software design, infecting the database with feminist intent and exploring the possibility for software to be feminist in its programming and technological design. We prototyped Scalar on the basis of a feminist assemblage we had steadily pulled together, one that involved work with well over 100 scholars, with an evolving platform, with forms of critical thinking that privileged affect, emotion, embodiment, and difference, with emerging and experimental aesthetic registers, and through extended collaboration. Feminist thinking is in there in Scalar from the context of our practice. There are very deliberate decisions about how the software is built, wrapping an odd implementation of semantic technology around a relational database platform, allowing less hierarchical data structures and a possibility for horizontal, flexible structures. We are now experimenting with one such space at USC in the form of the new Feminist Lab. It now houses Scalar and is the first shiny, pristine, fully outfitted space where we got to buy the furniture and paint the walls that our team has ever occupied in over 15 years of working together. A project of the Sydney Harman Academy of Polymathic Study, which I direct, the lab has a strong focus on hybrid undergraduate education. with the on-the-ground leadership by Associate Director Curtis Fletcher, also part of the Scalar team. We host a series of regular events that teach the use of digital tools within the context of social and cultural issues, fund Vectors-like research for faculty and student research teams, and sponsor polymathic summer research projects from students at the undergrad level. We also have funded a series of innovation scholars. I'm happy that most of them are women and students of color, to work on faculty-led collaboratories that are doing things like terraforming Mars, imagining the collapse of democracy, and embedding historical images from the LA Times photo collection into the fabric of Los Angeles through an AR app prototype. I'm working with a group of students on a new research project that's looking at the role of platforms in the spread of white supremacy online. Looking at the lab's website, it seems less overtly feminist than our Vectors projects did, even as I know that, as with Scalar, feminism is in there. Nonetheless, I think it's worth noting that along the path from Vectors through Scalar to the Amundsen Lab, the mark of feminism becomes less overtly visible in many of our efforts and in our official branding. Our greater stability and institutionalization runs the risk of blunting our feminist force. In building funded spaces and institutional support, this is always a risk to be aware of and to grapple with. We try to do so honestly and often, and it's not easy. It is probably not an accident that the dual embrace of theory and practice in feminist film studies during the 70s came at a time of widespread changes in communication technologies, from the advent of cheaper, more portable cameras to the broad diffusion of television and the emergence of cable. The feminists gathered to discuss feminist film in Edinburgh in 1979 understood their moment as a time to intervene in systems of production, representation, distribution, and exhibition, working on many fronts and through many modalities. They valued theory and practice, and they held the two in lively tension. The digital technologies of our own era call us to embrace similar strategies as we confront the diffusion of the digital through our dreams, our lives, and our labs. Thank you.
I would like to welcome up our next speaker. Marisa Parham is professor of English at Amherst College, and she directs the Immersive Reality Lab for the Humanities, which is an independent work group for digital and experimental humanities. IRLH develops and incubates digital projects for AR, VR, and screen, and supports the work of digital scholars. Parham also serves as a faculty diversity and inclusion officer at Amherst College. In this position, she's an advocate and innovator for diversity and inclusion in the college's overall academic program, while especially supporting both individual faculty success and the expansion of academic departments. Parham is the author of Haunting and Displacement in African American Literature and Culture, the African American Student's Guide to College, and she is co-editor of Theorizing Glissant Sites and Citations. Here is Marisa Parham.
Thank you. So as I gave and sort of produced my sort of blurb for today, I was really, struck by how in these moments of thinking about labs, thinking about institutions, thinking about work, et cetera, how it was interesting for me to return to the question of feminism. Because for me, it's always been a live question in this really complex way. It's not an easy term for me. And it's interesting because I teach classes in feminist theory, I do all this work, but I have to say my own sort of institutional experiences with feminism have been mainly negative. And that's something I've always had to navigate and negotiate. So I'm always in this very difficult place of upholding a thing in which I believe in the political mission of very deeply, but never actually having a place to enjoy it, right? And so thinking about that and thinking about how that's yet another way of thinking about this sort of intersection between theory and practice. In many ways, feminism itself is often theoretical. I'm also going to talk a little bit today about, and I think I said this in my blurb, thinking about the work that sort of gets done in the lab. And really, I think the speakers we've already had today have done a beautiful job of sort of articulating all the various things that can happen in labs. I help manage a lab, which is in this really sort of interesting place that I can talk more about later. It's an independent lab, so it's important. It's a lab through which we were able to create it because we had sort of access to institutional resources, or even the sort of kinds of imaginations of freedom that institutional resources can give you. But also we saw with that, we constantly talk about the golden handcuffs, right? And so we decided to step away from the institution. It was also just very true that institutional DH work, which I heavily support. So I'm also a former director for 5 College Digital Humanities, which I did for 4 years. You know, we launched upwards of 25 projects with mixed team PIs, or mixed PI teams of students, faculty, and staff across 5 colleges and universities. So I have a lot of institutional experience in DH, I should say. So part of my feeling of the golden handcuffs was precisely because I had a sort of deep tissue understanding of these configurations and how they work, and their sort of limits and possibilities. I should also say that for me, stepping away with IRL isn't necessarily a step away because I don't still do institutional work. But I'm thinking a lot, and this comes today, Jacqueline brought up, I'll be talking about it today, around the real question about what it means to think about the structures we make around our academic work as a way of reflecting survival strategies. But how do we also, ooh, I almost made a really bad joke. I keep wanting to almost say like thrival, right? I keep trying to put like survival and thriving into this sort of like, you know, human relationship. So how do we look for ways of thrivaling throughout all of this? That's a joke, not concussion. So, so I should also say with a grain of salt, between my work with 5 College Digital Humanities, which I did for 4 years, and now in my 3rd year as a senior administrator. So at my college, it's important to note that I'm a faculty diversity and inclusion officer, but that's actually a real senior administrator at my school. We don't have a provost office, so we end up with these weird titles like officer in a way. And that's been interesting as well because I'm constantly oscillating between some of the struggles around digital humanities work and digital work and diversity work. People often wonder how I went from being digital humanities to diversity. To me, it seemed like the same continuum. It was actually the same set of problems. You know, if you get a drink in me, one of my, I'm like, hey, but no, if you get a drink in me, you know, one of my common jokes is that, you know, I feel like digital humanities is sort of what helped all these people understand what it's like to be Black. Because the sort of constant push and pull of even being able to explain why you exist and what you do and how you're there and what it means and how it connects and et cetera. Not quite the same, but I think there's a there. There's actually a deep structural question around these things. And the thing that working so long, I've been in digital humanities a very long time. I joke because I was in digital humanities long before it was a field I think called digital humanities. But what it helps you understand is structure. Structure in terms of getting things done, structure in terms of thinking about how to make a new problem, the structures of thinking about how to solve problems as well. So I say this in case I need a way to get oriented to was my constant, and even I have a hard time keeping up sometimes with my sort of simultaneous optimism and pessimism. That's what being an administrator does to you. I should also say though, from my perspective, and this is important, and it gets on everyone's nerves, because I think when you're an administrator, you're supposed to be upbeat all the time in this weird sort of way. Even like, no, you can't have it, right? It's supposed to be a thing you're supposed to do. I saw a Facebook meme, I am wandering, I'm sorry, but I recently saw a Facebook meme that I posted, and it really sort of encapsulated for me, and it was about the real harms of what we call toxic positivity. And I was like, yes. Like that's the term I've been looking for all these years. So I'm just trying to stay away from that and keep my positivity really healthy by being pessimistic. So from my perspective, and I say this again as an administrator, but also as a person on the ground, everything is broken. This cannot be overstated. From the perspective of higher education, from the perspective of most institutions, from the perspective of many of the sort of configurations through which we try to do various kinds of work, I will stand by my assertion that our institutions are broken. Over time, strangely, and I'll be talking a little bit about this today, I've learned to go ahead and take comfort in this. Once I sort of realized that the things around me were broken, it took a lot of weight off of me for imagining that somehow I wasn't figuring something out. right? It took a lot of burden off of me in terms of figuring out, like, when all these things are going wrong, how could this be happening to me? Like, you have two options. You can either figure out everything's broken, or you have to get like real religious, like in a really deep sort of way. I'm not sure there's much in between if you're actually going to survive, much less thrive. I also say this in perspective of being institutionalized as an administrator, because one thing you begin to understand when you're dealing daily with people's grievances, their demands, their needs, and the things they want from you in order to make their lives workable or livable or communicable or et cetera, articulable, is that most of the things that people want in an institutional context aren't that big. It's not that much. And when you begin to really think about that, what does it mean for, I was trying to talk to someone, they're always talking about, for instance, sort of race in the academy stuff, and how, as if like these like big demands where people are like, if you don't install a swimming pool in my office, I will burn this place down, right? 'Cause that's how administrators end up talking about what people are demanding. Whereas all people are really asking for is like, can we please have a space in which I don't have to beg for a bathroom that accommodates me? They're literally just asking for bathrooms. Right, not to be so glib, but I think it's really important sometimes to really find a way to keep your eye on that. So everything is broken, and it's only notable, I'm not sure there's some sort of theological argument of the thing that's not broken that we all aspire to, but it's important to remember that things are broken because that gets us to the point of thinking about reasons. This is also important for me in the comfort I take in this, in understanding that many structures are less strong than they might seem. Most structures, particularly in higher ed, are actually quite fragile. I think the people who are usually in power know this, and that's part of why you get such a sort of constant threat assessment around your presence, right? And I think people who are farther along in their careers, or even earlier, you really begin to see this. That moment you realize, you're like, whoa, if I sit down and like my jacket makes a noise, I've just delivered a threat, right? And when you realize that constant, almost paranoia around you, right? You begin to understand sort of what's in play. And the kind of framing I use in this article I have coming out is really beginning to understand things are going to happen with or without you, and how you think about that as well. So I should also say, and something I'll be talking about today, I try as much as possible to approach from an intersectional perspective that's particularly grounded in Black diasporic perspective. This is not only because it comports with my subject identity, but because the kinds of oppression inherent to Western social, technological, and scholarly apparatuses are rooted explicitly in anti-Black racism. This includes the apparatus we refer to as feminism, and this is one of the most difficult questions here before us today. If we have a list of things we need to hack, in other words, it's important to think about ways of thinking through and beyond anti-Black racism, because it's really for everyone's good if we want the structures to be what we keep asking them to be. When I see a room like this, I see a lot of people working incredibly hard to make things new or different, but at some point people are hitting these walls, right? I'm thinking of a moment, and this is not implicating anyone here, this is actually just a different conversation I was having with someone about digital work, and they were talking about the difficulty of not having more representation by students of color in their program. And I was like, yeah, because you actually have to be able to think more deeply about what it means to attract people to your program. You have to think profoundly differently. And I know a lot of you are doing this work, I'm just trying to make the point, right? That you have to think profoundly differently about what it means to invite a person into a space. That the sentence, invite a person into a space, already reveals a power dynamic about a thing that's already gone wrong before you got there. Right, so again, how we think about this. I'm really thinking very heavily here. Sorry, I have that thing where I'm later in the day, so it's so hard, I heard everyone else talk. So I do apologize. But I'm thinking also about something Jacqueline Warnemont said earlier, and just sort of thinking about, and Liz Lush as well, is like thinking about these questions of lab versus co-op, and also real questions of, for instance, that moment of the my student. What's the capital? Because that moment of my student is parlayed as a kind of capital. Right? And so what does it mean? I think this all the time as someone who does work in AFAM and Black digital humanities and et cetera. There's a way in which even your presence can be a capital, right? And so how do you control that? How do you think about that? How do you make that actually productive? How do you do that in ways that don't make you feel used, but at the same time understanding that you have to be able to articulate your use value? But in thinking about this, right, and thinking about the things we have to hack for everyone's good, we come to our old adage that we love, that everything old is, right? Everything old is, we can say everything old is new again, but I stopped as I was writing this and I said, everything old is whatever, fuck it, it's old. Everything is old, right? It's also new again. The old keeps returning though, which is to say it's never left. For some reason my notes I typed tag this unwoot. So apparently you should say woot, everything old is new, and then you go unwoot. It's still haunting and terrible. That was amazing. And then I have another sentence, this is what does it mean? I think it's supposed to be a rhetorical flourish, but this looks like really like what does it mean? It's everything, and this came up during the Q&A during some of the previous sessions. It's everything that we might inherit, everything we have, everything that surrounds us irredeemably broken. We can make claims about fugitivity, about the undercommons. This is my absolute dominant modality for a very long time, right? But we have to also figure out, in light of that, where are those limits? So Jackie, I super love that for this you brought the Amit quote. It's one reason I was like sort of struggling to redo my slides, because when I saw this last night, I was like, that's it. And I made a point in this case also to sort of capture the entire thing, because I really loved it. It was, I think, a Sharon Mattern quote. It's about sort of like thinking about sort of the whiteness of design and New Deal, and sort of like technical solutionism. And then this from Sarah Ahmed with the feminist killjoy tag. In order to survive institutions, we need to transform them, but we need still to survive the institutions we were trying to transform. But then down here, I just loved it down here. It's like, breathe, it's gonna work out. And I was like, Twitter, are you speaking to me? Like, it was very late at night, and I felt like it was speaking to my soul, which is a different talk, right? Will Twitter break you, or does it speak to your soul? So yes, we think about this question of brokenness. We have to see this, and we have to think about moving forward, and thinking about how moving forward itself requires new kinds of reevaluations, new valuations of brokenness itself. We move, in other words, from brokenness as a sign of loss to brokenness as a sign for possibility. I used to say burn it all down. Now I just say break it. Maybe it's all the DH. As many of us know, breaking is an important step in making. At the same time, in making, we often reasonably strive to make things that are not broken. So I've recently been polishing up a project that's about breaking, called Breakdance. And I remember sitting in front of this sort of multi-layered glitch aesthetic thing, trying not to burst into tears when I realized that the sort of functionality I had made to display an idea about brokenness was actually just technically broken. And I really didn't want it to be. Brokenness actually does have its limits. Right? So for me, I back into the sort of theoretical or conceptual underpinnings with which I also work, and in this case, Edouard Glissant, and thinking about the logic of the archipelago. Right? For Glissant, this idea of the broken is always a moment for liberation, or a possibility for liberation, because the broken and revealing the seams between us and within us helps us understand our own boundaries and limits and the things that we can and cannot express and share with others. So alongside the idea of brokenness is the idea of, for instance, opacity. The idea that it's not the purpose of being in a community to make everything knowable about yourself. Right, and this is really important if you think about the ways in which various kinds of membership very often hinge on an imagination of sameness, right? So what does it mean to conceptualize community that's not premised on certain kinds of sameness? And is it possible? These are live questions, by the way. These aren't just rhetorical sort of flourishes, to me, to be clear. And so to think about this, we have to take care to understand the kinds of habits and processes we must put in place in order to uphold feelings of coherence and purpose, without at the same time requiring sameness and repetition. So for this one quote I just wanted to bring today to think about this. Relating realms of knowledge, questions, and solutions with one another cannot be categorized as either a discipline or a science, but rather as an imaginary construct of reality that permits us to escape the pointillistic probability approach without lapsing into abusive generalization. So prior to this, he gives an example of saying, what are we gonna do about the melting ice caps? How do we think about the loss of language in Northern Canada? How do we think about the ways in which Creole communities and Haiti? So he gives this sort of long list of all these things at the moment of writing that are happening. And he's trying to make the point here that it's really okay to cite all these things at once. And it's not just a throwing up your hands and going, OMG. And it's not just imagining these are all separate things, so we can make the, we sort of make the critique, I definitely always do this, of saying we can't flatten out and make everything the same. He's instead advocating for a sense of zooming in and zooming out. Right? So of course there are various moments when of course you zoom in the pointillistic you see every dot, every pixel that constitutes the same, but it's still okay also nonetheless to zoom out and see the bigger picture. However, how do we balance the specificity of individual subject relations over and against, right, the larger picture through which we also have to make comparisons if we're gonna actually make change. That's a fancy way of saying like, we can all be different, but we also have to unionize, right, at various moments. So thinking about this and thinking about my men work, which includes my lab, I think a lot about Glissant's sense of relation, of what it means to be put into play, orchestrated, community that's premised on something more than and also less totalizing than assimilation. I'm thinking here about a report I recently read, I remember I was recently reading about women in higher ed leadership, almost to a person, the sort of people blurbs, talking head moments, repeated some form of assimilationist logic as underlying their drive to become leaders. That the purpose of being a woman in power is to be a woman in power. That they want to show that they can do it too. At a sort of profound moment, and I'm implicating this against a senior administrator, of just realizing, I don't want you to show that you can do it too. I don't want them to do it too. I don't want to do it too. And in this case, when we do it too, the two that we're doing is just doing terrible things to other people. In MArchive, Alexis Pauline Gumbs used a speculative documentary approach to help her reader explore a future that's already happened. MArchive, the book, is a mangrove-rooted experience of working with Dr. Jackie Alexander, the kind of work exemplified in Alexander's pedagogies of crossing, which Gumbs is talking about here. Honoring pedagogies of crossing as an ancestrally co-written text and the ancestor to this book, MArchive after the end of the world, imagines another form, speculative documentary, which is not ancestrally co-written, but is also written in collaboration with the survivors, the far into the future witnesses to the realities we are making possible or impossible with our present apocalypse. And this is important because in this case, Gumbs is writing from the perspective is that despite how we're talking today, for instance, about environmental catastrophe, social disarray, and et cetera, and the ways in which in this particular moment this can take on an apocalyptic feeling, her argument is that from the perspective of Black people in the diaspora, the apocalypse has already happened. And so if you're working from the perspective of having already suffered through apocalypse, how do you even enter into a shared conversation today about apocalypse? But really struck me here, possible or impossible. I work a lot helping people learning how to create interactive and branching narratives. While working on this presentation, I kept thinking about ways to make this a branching presentation. I decided not to, but even as I talk now, I still hear Gumbs, possible or impossible. How do we make possible? How do we make impossible? Right, I'm thinking again, sorry, Jackie, I keep using you, but for your example, is that moment of like in a moment trying to make possible, you made impossible. Right? And we've all been in that place, to be clear, right? But really thinking about it, and thank you so much for surfacing that moment. I think about this also in terms of thinking about the things we always carry with us, whether or not we agree to carry it, right? It's back to the with or without you. I think in this case about call and response and the ways that is on the one hand a way to participate in a community, a kind of memory work in the present, the knowing of what you know and its articulation. Some of this is deep in the bones, from trauma and its reverberations to the end of easy knowings we access through cliche. I say everything old is, and you can just say new again, right? Why do we carry that? Why do we know that? Why does it occupy a space within us? What is made possible or impossible in this moment? What can we make from what we have? What is useful or true? What is dangerous? When thinking about brokenness, the archipelagic, as offering a kind of holistic approach to thinking about individuals and communities, how do we conceptualize pieces? How do we think about labs as often pieces of things that are starting from a place of a configuration that doesn't work and the lab is put in the place of trying to address a gap or a need? And I think this could be a positive thing, to be clear. But one might also think here of Eve Sedgwick in the Interdigitate, the fingers and hands, right? She has this whole thing of thinking about fingers, the work that hands do, but also the locking together of hands, right? So in the moment of coming together, it still comes apart. The discrete identity of each hand also locked together, and how you actually describe that figure. This is different from Booker T. Washington's hands of Black progress at the turn of the century during Reconstruction. He had a different theory, thinking about Blacks and whites living together as separate fingers of the hand. But embedded in this was also an argument that was very complex that was about the capacity of Black people to have economic freedom. Let us use our hands. What is made, again, possible or impossible in this moment? I'm thinking also about questions of theory and practice, thinking about women's labor and thinking about repetition. Thank you, Tara, for instance, for pointing out the ways in which, with all the emphasis today on making, I can't help but think about the long generations, I'm gonna go big, maybe thousands of years of somehow, right, denying across the globe. It's one thing the globe has in common is denying women's labor, right? And so thinking about this idea of the sort of making. My example I always give is at my particular institution. I remember I came in as a person doing digital work, and I remember having to sit through long conversations at department level, which they were not wrong, but sitting through these sort of long conversations at department level that were essentially about like, how are we gonna hide Marisa's making? How are we gonna hide her digital work? Because they knew back then that there was no way I would get tenure, because it was simply a sign that I was not a serious scholar. The fact that I made things. And it flips. I mean, the fact that I also am trained explicitly in literary theory, which I always talk about, becomes a weird thing where it works to, it can potentially negatively impact my status as a person who also makes things, right? I find myself equally asserting both, right? And those are structures. At some point I just get tired. I say, okay, let me know what it means. I have something fancier to say, but I say all the time. So whatevs, let me know. So in MArchive, one of the many images Gums brings to us is also a meditation on sand. And I'm particularly taken in thinking about her take on sand because it's a way of thinking about what it really means to say that everything can also be new, that even the oldest things have potential for being new things. And I'm sorry this is so long, but it's that kind of moment where like I sometimes have to belie my background sort of in literary studies and like, come on, it's so pretty. But I'm gonna start roughly about halfway through, just to read also, just in case people can't see, just to be clear. What if I would have told them, if I thought they could listen, was the same thing I told anyone who seemed to listen, that of course the sand was visibly different. Sand is what sand is, tiny remnants of fossils and stones and planets and shells all broken beyond recognition. Unless you look closer, unless you magnify each by 360 degrees, unless you become intimate and positively obsessed, and then you see where they came from, whole in their being, you see more possibilities than you thought you could see. There's a lesson there about what we have broken down into what has not broken us, how similar we look from a distance, how we stay being whatever we came from, what attention does and what it does not do, how we all become sand in the end. So she's picking up several threads here. This was written or published in 2018, probably written soon prior. She's picking up several strands here. One, you all probably saw it on the internets. For instance, there was these beautiful images circulating. I knew the person's name, I apologize. I can recall it in a moment, I'm sure. Who are sort of circulating in a sort of mashable, hyperallergic way. These beautiful images of sand magnified 300 times, right? And just realizing this sort of theory, or not the theory, but that sense of every grain of sand being different was in fact true. And not only that, when the average person, think back to Glissant's pointillism, when you're looking at sand, you can't see this, right? So even this thing you feel you know so much about or you can see or understand, we don't even have the instruments to see it properly, right? And there's a whole thing, as we know, about the question of science or scientific inquiry and how so much of it depends on our tools. And the fact that our tools don't know, tools and questions, that our tools aren't powerful enough to actually see things in the truest vein, which is huge quote marks, I know, but also thinking about the ways in which we don't even know the questions to ask. The common example of this, for instance, would be like the octopus, and be like, they must be so stupid, they have no brains, and realizing that the whole thing is just a brain. Not actually a scientist, but I'm sure I'm pretty close with my summary, but you see what I'm saying. There's another thing here this also resonates with in Gums that I find really quite striking, which is a line and also a novel title from Samuel Delany, Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, right? And she's also resonating here as well with Octavia Butler, a speculative fiction writer who Ash mentioned earlier, who in her own writing frames the term and coins the term positive obsession as a way to describe the work it takes to know a thing, a concept or idea, well enough to imagine it into alterity. So you know it so well, it blows up as anything recognizable. And ultimately, this radical alterity that comes through knowing a thing well makes possible alternative purposes or futures for that thing. Sand is what sand is. But Gums' point is that we never remember or recognize sand as having an isness. Not only the past of its own object form, but the isness that sand in its form has captured and released. Sand is fossils. These things, these moments of sand, each had their own lives, those are far gone and receded from us. They are only familiar to us insofar as we too eventually will become like it. Possible or impossible? We can take what we know we have suffered and witnessed, and we can say it out loud, all the things. We can take what we know we have suffered and witnessed and acts that is not to be repeated in the spaces that we manage, the spaces that we curate, and the spaces we've tried so hard. It was really pure blood, sweat, and tears to make possible. And I think of the labs that you all manage, right? We know structures, we know what they give. We know structures, we know what they take. I hear Hope and Gum's closing observation, right? That there's a lesson in all of this about what we have broken down into and what is not broken to us, how similar we look from a distance, how we stay being wherever we came from, what attention does and what it does not do, how we all become sand in the end. So as I begin closing, I also want to take a second to sort of look at and think about the various ways we can instrumentalize this thing that I'm saying very sort of conceptually about what it means to know things and witness things and want to transform those things into something else. So I was thinking about a conference that Ash and I were actually at in the fall, hosted by Tahir Hemphill, whose name, I'm sorry, I actually didn't put on here, but I can give it to you afterwards, Tahir Hemphill. And I was really struck at the time when you signed up for this conference. It was actually a Google form. And you had to sort of review the Google form and sort of agree to all of these things. And this was a tech conference that was mainly on AR, VR, and new forms of technological scholarly communication at the Library of Congress. And I have to say, I giggled when I saw this, like weird, sad, like laugh, cry, giggling, to be clear. Right, because some of it, of course, is really beautiful. Raise all voices. Right, during sessions, pay attention to who is contributing, invite contributions. So these are things I do in class, and we already know incredibly important to cultivating spaces. I'm sure many people in this room live in this space, to be clear, in this mode of practice. But then there were other ones, and this is when I start giggling, no feigning surprise. In an environment where participants have different backgrounds and knowledge, it's very important that people feel comfortable saying, I don't know or I don't understand. Therefore, please do not act surprised when someone says they don't know something, whether it's regarding a technical or non-technical subject, and then it gives you an example. What? I can't believe you don't know what X is, right? Feigning surprise has absolutely no social or educational benefit. When people feign surprise, it's usually to make them feel better about themselves. So I'm like reading a Google document, you know, doing my usual last minute sign up for a conference. I'm like, say it, you know, like yelling at the screen, right? And no, well, actuallys. Well, actually happens when someone says something that's almost but not entirely correct, and you say, well, actually, and then give a minor correct, right? You're laughing, right? Well, actually, interrupt the discussion and fixate on the minor. You know, and it goes on, and it goes on more clearly, no isms. We explicitly ban, right? But what I love about this is that he goes on to note, where these behaviors are overt or subtle, subtle isms can be particularly tricky. They're often unconscious behaviors we engage in by mistake. So I love that it goes to like the sort of educational modality in this in a way I don't think is actually condescending, and is repeated throughout. I only have an excerpt here, but I love it. He uses a sort of repeated tagline, apologize, reflect, move forward. There's no assumption here that everything is perfect and smooth and unbroken, that everything will work, but instead focuses on the idea of process. Apologize, reflect, move forward. So thinking about this and thinking about the idea of a lesson, therefore, sort of gets us to a place where we can think more about what we can make and what we want. And I'll start closing up here. We broke the earth and now we fall through time. Deep gashes in the ground. We scale the edges of our knowing. The smoother, the worse. The more jagged, the more better. What we stand on is not masonry. It is a torn place unhealed. The footholds come from how unclean the break. We broke the earth and now we fall through time because marching on a line we thought was forward only called up the urgency of the abyss. Who said with her dilating presence, you cannot live like this, cannot breathe the air here? And so we witness layers. The ground time is buried over, awakened like the amber of escape. The fossilized text we needed. Landfilled manuscripts freeze-dries by returning ice. We fell into the archive of our failure, and this is what we found. I mean it when I say it, this sense of the broken is absolutely a possibility. But looking for ways, as people have here today, to think about the places where we produce different kinds of success and also different kinds of failure, while simultaneously carrying with us the humility, right, to reflect, apologize, and move on. I'll stop there.
All right, we have a few minutes for Q&A with our two speakers.
I really enjoyed both the talks. It's really nice to have this here, and thanks for organizing. My question's really nuts and bolts for Tara, actually, and thinking you said that you built vectors on a fellowship model, and that was very successful in terms of promoting different kind of cross-disciplinary work. And I was curious if you could say more about what that is. I don't.
For the years we were doing the fellowships, we sent out an open call, and then we would ask people to, they didn't need to have any technological skill. They needed to have a sense that the materials they wanted to work with and the argument they were sculpting needed to be realized in some way in digital media. And they would describe that and their assets to us. And then we picked each summer, usually 10 to 12 fellows who came to USC for a week in the summer. We had a pretty intensive boot camp. You know, at that point we didn't have, in the beginning, any of our own software. Everything kind of got built from the ground up. And then each collaboration, which were pegged to themed issues, would last typically about 6 months, and those were remote. So the scholar was paired with an editor, who would be Steve Anderson or I, with a designer, Eric Lawyer or Reagan Kelly, and Craig Dietrich usually worked more behind the scenes on implementing the technology the designers needed. And in the beginning, there was a lot of conversation trying to understand what the scholar wanted to do, and then everything was built collaboratively. So the scholars didn't describe a thing to us and then we built it. Instead, everybody worked together over the space of that, you know, entire timeline. And it was hard, and there were moments of incredible friction, and we got much better at learning how to support collaboration across differences of many kinds, but it was also incredibly rewarding. Yeah.
Hi, so you both touched on this sort of idea of the bias that's inherent within technology and within these technological structures that you're working in. But how do you get past that? I mean, how do you manage to do something that is truly not just replicating all of these sorts of biases that are inherent, that are problematic racial and sexist structures?
I think it's different depending on the circumstance. So what I'm hearing in your question, and tell me if I'm wrong, like usually when I hear sort of bias in tech, I'm thinking of like, you know, Sophia Noble's work around bias and algorithmic understanding, for instance. But I'm also hearing in your question something that's thinking about social structure. And I think it's really important that, and we know this is just repeating a platitude, but we know that technologies emerge out of social structures, and we also know social structures emerge out of technologies, right? So I think the question therefore, for me, is usually thinking about what it means to stage an intervention. So I'm listening, for instance, to the response that Tara just gave, and talking about the work, the early work of vectors, and thinking about, you know, what we've done with our lab, which is thinking very hard about what it means to include work by people who without technical background, in the full inclusion, not just, as you said, like they tell you what they want and you build a thing, right? To me, that's one of those places where you really get sort of the nitty-gritty of the inequities built into sort of technological knowledge. But it's interesting because in that moment, let me step back a moment. In the moment of what I've just said, it's not just thinking about kinds of inequities that are built into technologies, but built into how we parlay technologies. That's why I love so much the thing I had up from Tahira Himful, is that sort of moment where, you know, don't act surprised when someone doesn't know something. That's one of those structures. Right. There's another one, I was skimming through it, but if you saw, where, you know, he sort of briefly says, you know, when you're describing technology and you say something like, this is so easy, you know, my grandmother could do it. You know, someone has a grandmother like, you know, F you, right? And I'm sorry, but that's a way of thinking about how these things are also built with structures. And of course, there are other kind of complex things that are also, of course, about race and class, economic class, social. So I'm thinking about, you know, every website, you know, which has like the little, we call them now the little hamburger menu, and how, you know, who sees that and knows what it means, right? There's a constant sort of major apparatus that's the basic, one of the foundations now of modern web navigation, that's a fundamentally sort of hidden knowledge that you only get through a certain kind of social knowing and experience. But it's such a small and innocent thing, right? And so how do you really think about what it means to make a site? One of the sites I'm working on right now are projects where I sort of break everything so that links don't work the way you expect. You move your mouse, something weird happens. But what I'm trying to explicate is a sense of we shouldn't have such a high level expectation around functionality, because that high level expectation around functionality, it's itself an expectation and understanding of social structures that we don't always want to agree with, right? And that doesn't necessarily at all make those structures go away, but how do you at least help people think about it? And this is also my diversity officer part. You can't make anyone do anything, right? But you can help people understand things about themselves that can therefore transform their behavior on other people. Another small example, and I wrap, I'm sorry, I'm like babbling. But the other fast example I give of this is, I was co-hosting Symposium last year with a colleague of mine who's male, who I also co-teach with, who's white. And we were talking about all the complex things we have to do in order to make sure that the students don't automatically begin deferring to him and ignoring me. And it's really interesting to watch. And these are students coming to small institutions, which people know us. We're known quantities in a way, right? But there are little things where, I'm not doing it now, I'm doing it now to avoid the light. But we always make a point, we say, I stand at the podium, and he can sit in a random chair, right? When we were having a symposium, for instance, there was a moment where one of the things I love doing, and I try to inculcate this with people in the lab, is I love to serve. And I try to attract people to the lab who also love to serve. I think it's incredibly important to be okay with serving others. It's just my background, it's what I care about. The people, because of their race and gender backgrounds, the people who come to my lab often care about as well. They want to serve, but they're sick of being taken advantage of for serving, right? But I was saying how it was this moment where we had food, and I sort of by default started explaining what everything is in serving people. And someone sort of makes this comment, and they're like, well, I feel like you should put an apron on or something, right? And it was a great moment, because on one hand, I was like, you're right. Because I'm a beautiful smock, I should be wearing an apron. But of course, that's not what they're saying, right? And it was like just seeing how fragile my status was, that literally if these hands, my brown body and these hands touch that food on a plate and hand to someone, I've literally destroyed the structure I've worked so hard to make in terms of my own sort of presence and authority.
Yeah, and I think it's also, there's a lot of really good work right now that's investigating the ways we could see historical structures coded into data. And I think teaching that material and sharing it broadly is important. Sophia's work is great. Wendy Chun's new work at looking at how sameness and homophily get coded into systems and make certain things unseeable. Looking at how racial factors are built in as invisible variables to sentencing and parole software. There's a lot of really good work. I've looked historically at how we might understand code structures in early operating systems to mimic social structures of segregation, right? So that kind of work, I think, helps us understand that. We could go further back to feminist film theory and understand that, the very visibility that was possible on film stock had to do with using whiteness as a visual default, right? So of all those examples, I think help people understand. I think the most important thing we need to do right now is break down the silos in which computer science is taught. My university has an engineering school where ethics is 3 weeks in the writing class of students who will be programming our futures, quite literally, right? And I'd say 2/3 of our innovation scholars are students who came to the lab to apply for those positions. Over 100 students did, because they're engineering students who deeply understand their work is functional and dissociated from any social meaning in their engineering classes, right? So if we want software systems that respect difference, we have to train the people who make software systems to think about difference and the social.
you.